All right, so we've been talking about designing training templates, and something that happens somewhat regularly with people as they're creating templates for athletes is that the templates get kind of cluttered, right? There's a lot of stuff in them. It's not super clear what the priorities are. We've mentioned this on previous podcasts, but people are trying to slot together a few different progressions. They have a variety of things they're trying to improve, several things that they want to put on maintenance, a cool exercise that they recently learned at a certification that they did, and it just becomes kind of a mess, right? So one of the challenges with designing solid training templates is understanding what is a priority and what can be sort of like put on the back burner, and then also what needs to be maintained. So today we're going to focus on this discussion about prioritizing improvement in something versus maintaining something, right? And I think that something that I've seen from coaches who are trying to write training templates, and it sort of ends up messy and not necessarily prioritizing the things that they think they're prioritizing, is that this idea of maintaining is a little bit fuzzy, right? It's not super clear what needs to be done to maintain certain traits. So they're just sort of slotting stuff in because they're like, oh, well, we spent all this time improving chest to bar volume tolerance. Like we can't let that go, needs to be there, which like may be partially true. But without a good understanding of like what it looks like to maintain something, they can sort of over-engineer the template and then just turn everything into a messy stew. So, Luke, what do you got for us? How do you put things on maintenance?
Yeah, I think the is a challenge for coaches to sort of understand when just to sort of say no to something or when to eliminate it from the training plan. But with regards to maintaining something, it generally is when that individual is able to perform as sort of required in the field of competition that they are hoping to compete amongst. And a reference point for that can be the CrossFit Game season. And we have within the CrossFit Game season these, these sort of very, you could say these tangible volume landmarks, these tangible weights and barbells and things like that we see. We see patterns sort of emerging as, just with 2 years of quarterfinal workouts. There's always going to be something new that's sort of thrown in there. But what we can start to do is understand, okay, well, you can't snatch this weight and you want to be able to do this on, what has been is the final workout of quarterfinals has been like a heavier, shorter type sprint workout.
The last 2 years, it was a similar
Yeah.
variation of like a heavy-ish snatch burpee
So,
box
like,
jump over.
take that for instance, if someone is unable to hit that weight, then we know we need to work on that if that's something that they want to be competitive within. But if someone can hit that weight and is feeling fairly confident, but might be lacking on their sort of capacity when it comes to running, rope climbs, longer workouts, and that type of stuff, and they're just not at the mark, then you know that you can potentially put the snatch work, the strength work, that type of stuff on maintenance, and you can then actually start to sort of divert the resources, the time, the energy towards the stuff they need to work on. For that individual, maybe they actually just need to snatch once a week and they just need to be sort of within a productive range of weight. And it doesn't really matter too much what they're doing week to week. And I think one of the things that people can get wrapped up in is sort of the success of a training piece and then how that looks over the course of, say, 2 to 4 weeks of sort of working on a similar thing. When if we actually sort of think about, how often people actually PR in their lifts or make new records on time trials and that type of thing, in the grander scheme of things, that type of stuff happens quite rarely when people have a decent amount of training volume and training time under their belt. So if we sort of take the focus away from the individual training session and the sort of short-term progression over the course of, say, 2 to 4 weeks, it sort of starts to open up opportunities for us to be able to target in on those priority areas and be okay with putting certain things on maintenance. I think as well, another thing is also when people first start getting into the sport, generally there's an area that they will gravitate towards to, and they will either see rapid improvement or they will see themselves doing pretty well at. from the get go. And if that's the case, that's usually a good indication of what needs to be maintained as well. It might be that they don't necessarily need to have too many touches on it to sort of maintain that skill there. And I think that if someone moves from a general program where you're doing a lot of different things to a lot more of an individualized program, it can be quite jarring because you're not necessarily having all these, these touches. And I think of like my own personal experience when, Todd, you were coaching for me. It was like I moved from something that was very general for a lot of years, where it was like I do this lift on this day and this day, and what a lot of people go through. And then you had me doing, spending the majority of my time on machines, and I was like, oh, I'm not, yeah,
and
right,
deadlifting.
Like,
yeah, and high rep deadlift. Yeah.
And just
it's just like, all right, row and high repetition, moderately loaded deadlift. Okay, that's what's going to stop you.
They were like, okay, but it was for me. I was like, okay, I'm going to lose all of that, like the things that I was sort of good at. But in the grander scheme of things, I was performing a lot better on the things that were holding me back. And I think that a lot of athletes, they can they can get a little bit too wrapped up in sort of the training rhythms that they may have been in previously, and it's sort of like that's the way that I go about it, and that's the way everyone trains. And if you do look at a lot of elite athletes, and you look at like the sort of the more blog and templated style training that that a lot of these elite athletes are doing, they are fairly successful off of it, but they're also elite athletes for a reason. It's because they're incredibly gifted and they work very hard and they've got the time, energy, and resources to do so. So they can actually play that game where it's not really about prioritizing, it's just about doing a bunch of work. As an example, at the gym I train at, the coaches and the owners are competitors and they compete a lot. And I know that they just sort of like do a general training program that's super high volume. And they have like maybe a 3-hour gap between classes in the afternoon. And that's sometimes when I go in and train. And I just notice at how they go about their training. And they literally just do a training piece and then they rest for like 10, 15, 20 minutes and chit chat, go on their phones. And then they do another one. And because they've got the time and energy to sort of do it that way, the focus for them is about just doing the work and getting the work done. And it's not necessarily about, okay, I've got an hour and a half slot here. I have, a bunch of other things that are sort of competing for my energy, family, work, all that type of stuff. They can sort of just have that focus that's on just doing the work, and that tends to, do them well when it comes to competitions because they've just put in a ton of work, and it's sort of like a bit of a blunt force approach about it. Whereas I think that prioritizing your training a lot of the time is just understanding also when to say no, or when to say, okay, that's on maintenance and I'm going to do a lot less of that.
Yeah, totally. We talked about that many times, where people who are kind of gifted and have a lot of bandwidth and recovery currency to spend can just kind of do a lot of anything and everything, and that essentially works out for them. And they may not have to think as much about some of the concepts that we talk about, right? That doesn't mean that they might not benefit from it if they were to, potentially train in a more thoughtful way. But that's actually just not necessary for everybody, right? But yeah, I did want to touch on some of the things you're talking about with like maintenance versus prioritization, right? So like we said, this is a thing that can be very tricky for coaches, and I think results in a lot of cluttering of templates and unclear priorities. And one thing that is very variable across individuals is their sort of like baseline level in a lot of different things, and then the speed at which they adapt to new training, right? So again, if you look at athletes who are typically very elite, their baseline level of fitness in like just doing random CrossFit stuff or being able to snatch heavy under fatigue or having some, fast time trial or whatever is often high. And not only is their baseline level high, but if they train that thing specifically, they get better quickly and often more quickly than other people, right? So it's like you're already better than most people and then you get better faster is kind of like the avatar of someone who tends to be at an elite level in a sport, right? But that said, between different individuals, like those things kind of like aren't necessarily the same, right? So some people, you can have them not deadlift basically ever. And then you're like, okay, yeah, just like build to a tough single for today. And they deadlift a house, right? And it's like, for that individual, just whatever they're sort of blessed with, like they don't have to train their deadlift. And as long as they're just kind of working out in general, it's going to be fine, right? For other people, that's not necessarily the case, that the deadlift is a movement that if they're not constantly working on it, constantly practicing positions, doing all kinds of like hip controlled articular rotations and PRI breathing exercises or whatever, if they do more than 3 deadlifts, their back like completely explodes and they feel horrible, right? So for that individual, it's like, okay, like we need to work on deadlift consistently just so you're able to even do it without problems. And so as a coach, you start to recognize some of these things and you probably sort of intuitively know that about different athletes. Like, oh, this person doesn't even need to touch the stupid rower because they can just like hop on that thing and it's easy for them compared to other people. Whereas for other folks, that's not the case. And even getting enough power to like hold the pace that would be required for them to compete at the level that they want is like, that's a tough effort. So you need to be touching that consistently to be able to even hit the numbers that we want you to hit, right? So, being aware of where athletes sit as kind of like their baseline fitness with different kinds of tasks, I think is important. And then also being aware of like how quickly does this individual improve when they're training can help you sort of like make sense of like what the maintenance conversation looks like, right? Because if someone has this just like natural ability for this certain kind of thing, as long as they work out, it's there. What does maintenance look like for that? It might look like not even touching it because they're just working out and you only need to touch it when they're like really leading into competition to make sure it's there. Whereas for other people, maintenance might be, yeah, you know what? Like you have this tendency for your handstand push-ups to be just the hardest possible movement for you and you can't even get through the volume of it. And we can train that volume up by exposure and then we don't touch it. And then all of a sudden it's like, great, we have to do another 6-month progression of like assorted deficit strict handstand push-ups for you to even be able to do it. Like the maintenance conversation there might look different. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think when you sort of notice these patterns with people like you were saying, and I think that one of the things just with like recent conversations when I was getting coaching from Jacob, when he was listening to him and then listening, I think, to the folk on the reactive training systems podcast as well. They were sort of mentioning an idea around like the program is as broad and general as it needs to be at the very beginning, and then bit by bit it becomes more individualized, and then the training program essentially is like a communication tool as well. And I think that's quite interesting to sort of play around with, because this idea of what we're talking about, the issue that we are seeing is that people basically become too they hold on to this idea of a balanced training program way too much. It's like, okay, I snatch and back squat on a Monday, I do clean and jerks and deadlifts on a Wednesday, and it basically looks like that typical weightlifting, powerlifting, CrossFit program that you're going to see quite often. And then they don't necessarily have the back and forth, the sort of and the individualization from there on. And if you look at like we were saying with sort of these talented athletes and these elite athletes, they can actually stay on that very general program, and they're actually progressing through it from like doing it once a week or whatever it is, and they just got to make sure. And that could be also a reason why they're successful, because they're constantly getting touches on things that are progressing everything. And I suppose that the issue is that sometimes you do come across these people, and this is one thing I've started playing around with, is just starting off with a very broad program, and then bit by bit just making it a little bit more individualized, as opposed to sort of test them and then just smash them on sort of certain things straight away, because you do sort of need to figure out what are those things that they don't really need to do very often, but at the same time, those things that might need a little bit more structure and a little bit more exposure to, because sometimes you'll also come across people when they have a training age which is quite long, where they're only just doing the sort of same things but just rehashed in a certain way. And I think I remember on I think it was on one of the Training Think Tank podcasts, I was listening to Max saying that like Neil Olsen is just literally is always going through some form of like deadlift progression. And then that is like an example of someone at the highest level where it's like, okay, you just need to constantly working on this thing. And I think that with CrossFit, it's a broad enough thing where that can look really different for everyone. It's not going to be the same, and this is obviously the reason why individualized training is super important within this sport, because you want to be able to sort of maximize on those opportunities and make sure that like you're not just throwing training away by just rehashing the sort of same old thing. But what you said there earlier about the idea of people not having to have too many touches on a certain thing, it reminded me of, I think it was like an analogy that I heard a weightlifting coach talking about, like how essentially PED use works, and it was essentially like you have your minimum effective volume and you have your maximum effective volume, and the minimum effective volume is sort of like that. Okay, you need to be doing 2 exposures of this one thing to make improvement, and then maximum is obviously something you build up over time. But that window, the difference between the two, just becomes exponentially bigger. And I suppose one of the things that you're trying to do with people's training isn't necessarily like encouraging them to take beds and to open up that window, but you're trying to design the training in a way where you create those windows to be as open as possible, so that like it's all of the training is effective, and then if they have the time, resources, and energy, they can actually just do more work, and it still becomes effective because you've sort of found that rhythm and that structure, which allows every single bit of their training to be somewhat effective.
Yeah, that's insightful. So it both reduces the minimum effective dose and increases the maximum tolerable.
Yeah, so like if you
totally
pick up a barbell, that just increases your max, and then if you do a strenuous set, that's cool because you can do 1,000 strenuous sets the next week.
Yeah, totally. No, yeah, I mean that makes perfect sense. The other thing I wanted to touch on with maintenance stuff, which we've hit on with other podcasts in the past, is just this idea of playing the sport, right? So this is something that I think has been discussed previously in like the CrossFit Journal and all that stuff. And I remember being like blown away by it when I was first reading some of that stuff, where it's like, oh, you can work on double unders and get better. Whoa, right? Or like, Rudy from Outlaw being like, the snatch is really just a muscle up if you think about it. And you're like, oh, I get it. Like, oh, cool. Right? It's like by snatching, you're improving your muscles, right? Which I mean, sure, there's something to that, but that kind of, everything is everything, man. Like all movements are connected. That I think that stuff doesn't hold up, that you need to do a certain amount of sport specific practice on specific movements to improve them. And just like the transfer between exercises is extremely finicky and hard to understand and plan for.
I think back then there was like an element to it, because it was like, okay, there was an element that because the people who were the best at the time were also generally like quite skilled, and you didn't have to like prepare for, how many double unders was it in like the 2018 Open? It was like, I think top people were doing like 800 double unders or something like that in the workout. And it's like, I forget which one it was. It was the one I particularly liked. It was 18 It was the one with like either 100 double unders was like between every single movement. And I remember like top performers were getting like 800 double unders. And
Oh,
it's like,
yeah,
yeah,
it was like the
like
overhead squats and
don't give
muscle
me
ups.
everything
Yeah,
is
yeah.
everything. If you haven't done 800 double unders or 150 GHD sit-ups, like you're not getting through that workout.
Yeah, totally. But yeah, right. So I mean that's kind of like a goofy thing where, when you're first exposed to it, you're like, whoa, man, like never thought of it that way, right? And you're like, oh, sick. But the I do think there is something to the idea of once you've created adaptation and then you play the sport using that adaptation, that kind of like locks things in, right? So we talked about making sure people are consistently doing sport specific training or like sport specific activity, like quote unquote scrimmaging, with some frequency, even if they're on some sort of off season cycle. And I think that that's something that really does work well for a lot of athletes, right? Is that you don't necessarily need to be like, okay, we're putting this on maintenance, which means we have this day dedicated to this. We're putting this on maintenance, which means we have this day dedicated to that. And then we also have this that we need to maintain from before. And then we have our current training priorities, which again just turns into this mess. Like it's not clear what's actually being prioritized. But if we're like, listen, we have 3 actual priorities, like you always need to deadlift no matter what because you're just terrible at it. So that's part of it too. And then we have sport specific training, like scrimmage style scenarios. That does a pretty good job of maintaining a lot of stuff for people. And that's where some of the like variance and just messy CrossFit stuff does really, really well for people because they do get touches on things. There is some sort of, generalized like, okay, you hit this basic pattern under fatigue, which means that you're not going to totally quote unquote forget how to do it. So that's I think a very, very valuable tool for people that can sort of bridge the gap between this like over-engineered, super crazy cycle and this very free form like, oh yeah, we just spent 3 hours with the lads at the gym like hitting workouts and scrolling Instagram.
Yeah, I think that people don't understand the sort of transference that you get from other things as well. I think the sort of, however many movements there are involved, like I remember sort of previous programming I would do would be get all the open movements and then try to make sure they're all sort of like touched on within a certain time frame. Whereas like I've moved a lot more away from that because just the sort of transference. Maybe you throw in a workout with an athlete who's sort of like off season and has got a bunch of bar muscle ups in. And they're like, oh, I was like chicken winging the last few and everything. It's like, okay, cool. I will just put that in at like a sooner point than sort of we've left it for the last time. But yeah, I definitely think that like I said before, it's sort of like there's way too much focus on the individual training piece as opposed to, okay, what does it look like over the course of a month? Or, where, and I think when people actually start to think about where either they will.
Wait, sorry. What do you mean by individual
so like
training there?
You're sort of mentioning like this idea of just sort of having common touches on playing the sport. And I'm sort of saying that I think that where you might get resistance from that is when someone might be just putting a little bit too much emphasis on the individual training piece that they're going through. And it might be just a point of like, oh, I really need to be working on this, or I need to make sure that that's the sort of focus point of this training session. When, like you said, sometimes you just actually need to play the sport and throw in a bit of random sort of chaos. Maybe not random, but like you need to make sure that like there is a bit of chaos in there that's managed. But that mindset does tend to like play way too much emphasis on the individual training piece and sort of how that works within the grand scheme of things. When in actual fact, like the people who do the best, the people who are actually able to sort of figure out ways of practicing and playing the sport more often. And we've sort of talked about this when people are turning, you can look at things as okay, they're doing some strength endurance work here, or some speed strength there, or they're working on their lactate power on this, or something like that. When people actually, when they have enough experience, they're sort of using CrossFit workouts to essentially work on all of those things. And that's how they develop it. And it's not necessarily this like very planned out way of working this energy system here and this strength there, and then we do a metcon at the end of it. And I think the talented individuals, those, like you said, who are able to sort of progress. And I think that the point you made with once adaptation has been made, I think that's really important, because I think a lot of people are afraid of just losing something, or their athletes losing something, if they just don't have constant touches on it. And to be honest with you, maybe they actually will find something a little bit harder. Maybe it takes a couple of training sessions to sort of bring it back to where it was, or maybe a couple of weeks or something like that. But that's also part of it. You can't expect to be constantly making improvement on everything all the time. And just that sort of, I think what we're very much talking about over the course of this podcast is sort of just, it's taking in that feedback and making sure that the plan is like dynamic, and it's not necessarily just like this thing that's set in stone. We follow it for 6 weeks and then we bring it in again and we figure out where we need to go. I think it's about staying dynamic, making sure there's progression there, and understanding when like you need to push on something and when you need to potentially pull back away from something. I've recently, I think it was, I had like an athlete doing a competition, and they weren't necessarily getting the consistency that they wanted in terms of training. And I sort of had these progressions in mind of like getting them ready to sort of, prep before a competition, getting them used to intensity and stuff like that. And it got to a point where they were sort of like missing a couple of sessions here and there, and they were missing some of them. And I was like, and then I got to a point where I was programming, I was like, I'm just going to have to give them metcons. So then I was like, okay, I'm just going to go onto, the competition's website, take all of their previous workouts down, try to make some sort of variation where they're working on something that they need to do a little bit harder. But it was sort of that idea of just canning what I had planned, because that was sort of the map and the territory, right? Because they weren't actually able to get the sort of desired results from it because of the sort of week-on-week progression. And it was like actually going to be a better use of their time just to do CrossFit workouts and almost just like compete every day in the gym for the sort of running weeks up to it, because they had a limited time.
Yeah, I think that you touched on something which I think gets at the heart of some of these issues, at least for some athletes and some coaches, which is this idea of progression and almost like linear progression, right? That people kind of intuitively think that they're on some sort of trajectory, and it's like, okay, I'm here, which means that I now need to be here. And if I go backwards, then I have to do the exact same thing I did before to get to this next step, right? That it's just like this single path, and like going backwards means I'm off track. Like I've gone backwards. Everything is ruined. I'm in trouble, right? And that's just not how it actually works, right? That you can see progress on something and like get to a point like, okay, you've improved, great, awesome. And then when you potentially quote unquote lose that fitness or you lose that adaptation, that doesn't necessarily mean that you have gone backwards, right? That it's like, oh no, actually, that you might not be able to do exactly what you were doing before, but you can you can get back to where you were much more easily than you could the first time you had to get there. Right. So that's something that can be a little bit difficult to understand, or not even just understand, but emotionally understand. Right. Because you're like, I spent all this time working on being able to snatch 100 kilos, and then I didn't snatch for a while, and I can no longer snatch 100 kilos. Like I'm over the hill. These younger athletes are lifting so much more weight than me. Like I've lost it. I had that shoulder injury. Like I'm screwed, whatever, right? All these thoughts that just kind of like spin in athletes' heads about how they're not actually as good as they thought they were, and everything is falling apart, and they're like on the downward slope of their athletic trajectory, which like, yeah, okay, maybe that's true. But honestly, like you're probably just fine. Like you're just going to be okay. Yeah. Just do it a few times. You'll figure it out.
You could probably use like, say like a team, the sort of like a team sport example where say you've got like a football or a soccer team who's, at the bottom of the league, and for them to get to the top of the league, it just takes a lot of work for them to get there. And there's, a couple of points where they have to sort of stall and things like that. And then maybe then they get to the top, and then they then experience a dip in performance, and they go halfway down the league, and it's like they don't have to go through all of that again to get to the top, because they know sort of how to do that. And obviously, is it going to be there's sort of like some form of like dynamic systems, right? And I think that us trying to develop lots of different skills within a sport like CrossFit, and the fact that every competition that we go to and all of these types of things is always going to be a little bit different, like that can be maybe a good analogy for people to sort of understand, is that you have lots of different things interacting with each other, and it's not necessarily, you don't have to go through the same old thing again. A lot of training is about just sort of teaching people experiences and just teaching people options, and sort of and obviously creating capacity and creating better, people to be fitter, stronger, and faster. But a big part of it is just sort of giving people the experiences or the learning experiences for them to be like, oh, right. And they just like figure it out. And then once that happens, like that is a lot more significant than some physiological improvement of fitness or something like that, because that type of stuff you can get back, and it's fairly simple to get that back. But those learning experiences and those I don't know how to, those less tangible things to sort of try and get and trying to improve on can be really difficult to get in the first place. But once you've got it, you're not necessarily going to lose it as you're not going to lose it and have to go through all of the previous work to get it back.
So yeah, in terms of maintenance stuff, right? I mean, I think that takeaways might be understanding how to put stuff on maintenance is one of the most important things to avoid super cluttered templates, especially for the kind of coach or athlete who would listen to a podcast like this, probably someone who enjoys collecting information and a lot of like detail and context for what they're working on. So being able to say, you know what, this is not an actual priority and this is something that is going to be on maintenance is important. And then understanding what that maintenance looks like, right? So you can actually free up training time and sort of like adaptation currency from that athlete to focus on the things that are priorities is really important. Practical takeaways from that: be aware of athletes who maintain a relatively high ability in certain capacities, kind of regardless of what they do, compared to people who don't. And then also be aware of the time it takes them to sort of ramp up that ability. Because again, that's extremely variable across individuals. And so that can really dictate what maintenance should look like for them. Being willing to sort of like let things go on purpose is important, right? Like if you decide to do that, maybe you made a mistake and you're going to make mistakes, but being willing to say, yeah, you know what, we're going to let this go. That's a risk that you're going to have to be willing to take in order to really focus on some stuff. So what else, Luke? What did I miss? What's another practical takeaway?
I think you covered it all. You've covered everything I have written down here.
All right. Great. We'll take it.